Good afternoon. My name is James Dudley. I'm the Economic Counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Brazil. Welcome to our Direct Line to American Business conversation with Ambassador Tom Shannon. This event is part of our economic statecraft effort to support the American business community. Tom Shannon has been the U.S. Ambassador to Brazil since December 2009. Before becoming Ambassador, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and before that he was Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the White House at the National Security Council. He also served at this embassy from 1989 to 1992, which gives him an appreciation of the dramatic changes in Brazil over the last 2 decades. After the Ambassador makes introductory remarks, we'll start answering your questions. Please feel free to submit questions at any time, and please note which company you're with. This is a chance for you to hear how the Ambassador and other senior U.S. government officials view Brazil's economy and the opportunities for U.S. companies. Our team also includes industry specialists who will get in touch with you afterwards if any of your questions cover details that they're better able to address. Ambassador Shannon is joined by the Embassy's Principal Commercial Officer from the Department of Commerce, Devin Rambo. Mr. Ambassador?
Great. Thank you, James. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time to have a conversation with us. With both James and Devin, we've got our economic and commercial teams here at the Embassy, and we believe that we can help answer most of the questions that you've got today. If we run into something we can't answer, we'll get back to you. But today's a special day. We're celebrating economic statecraft in the Department of State, and following up President Obama's very clear instructions to us through the National Export Initiative to focus on promoting American exports to Brazil and Brazilian investment into the United States, and the very aggressive action of Secretary Clinton to ensure that our embassies overseas, working with our colleagues in the Foreign Commercial Service, are capable of meeting the needs of American companies looking to either invest or operate overseas, or to attract Brazilian investment back in the United States. We have a very clear mandate to reach out to the business community and to engage in commercial diplomacy. And in fact, we have made of our embassy and our 3 consulates a nucleus of commercial diplomacy here in Brazil. And we hope to be able to work with all of you to meet your interests and needs here in Brazil. From my point of view, this is an exciting time to be in Brazil for all the reasons you're familiar with. This is a country that's gone through enormous transformation over the past 20 years, politically, socially, and economically. But behind this all, there's a dramatic commercial driver, and it's an emerging domestic market that's going to be increasingly attractive to American businesses, not only to sell into that market, but also to use Brazil as a platform to sell into the region and then beyond. And it's our hope today to be able to engage with you and address some of your concerns, answer your questions, and help you come away with a much better understanding of what it means to do business in Brazil. We think we're at a unique moment in the U.S.-Brazil relationship. We're building what we call a partnership for the 21st century. The visits by President Obama to Brasilia and President Rousseff to Washington highlighted not only the core features of this 21st century agenda, which is largely focused on science and technology, innovation, education, energy, and infrastructure, but also the fact that as we engage, both leaders see our business communities as being one of the principal points of interaction and one of the areas where we can most immediately produce results not only for our companies but also for our citizens. So again, we want to welcome you to this chat room today where we have the opportunity to engage with all of you on the concerns and questions you have, and I would like to open it for questions.
Okay. Thank you. Our first question for the Ambassador is whether you have any advice for U.S. companies, things they should keep in mind when thinking about doing business here.
Well, remember, Brazil is a continental country. It's like the United States. It's large, and it's regional, and it's diverse. And so the advice that goes for Sao Paulo might not go for Recife, and the advice that goes for Recife might not go for Campo Grande. So first we have to focus on not only the products that you're interested in selling or the investments you're interested in making, but also what your market's going to be and where you want to do this kind of work. Luckily, we have tremendous expertise at this embassy, both in our 3 consulates, but also broadly through our national commercial outreach here in Brazil. And we can provide very specific market-oriented advice. But broadly speaking, it's important to understand a few things about Brazil. First, this is not only a growing economy, it's a growing market. And because of it, it has a domestic component to it, a domestic demand to it, which is going to become more interesting over time. And the sooner you get into the market, the better you will be. Because once you're in the market, you will, based on your own experience and your own expertise, begin to gain a feel for what you need to be doing in terms of your business and your product in order to make a sale. Secondly, the Brazilian government is very intent on using commerce and investment to address long-term economic and social development goals. In other words, to make Brazil a developed country. And so they're very focused on partnering with American companies to build technological capacity, industrial capacity, and human resource capacity. And the extent to which your companies are prepared to and can engage with the Brazilians in this fashion, whether through acquiring Brazilian companies, partnering with Brazilian companies, or making investments directly into the country that produce industrial capacity and human resource capacity, you'll be very welcomed. I think it's also important to understand that in Brazil, once you're in, you're in. There really is no discrimination in any systematic sense against foreign companies that operate inside Brazil. Everybody operates by the same roadmap and the same set of rules, which makes it, I think, a good environment for American companies.
Thank you. Our next question is from Portal Commerce and Logistics. Mr. Ambassador, how do you expect the current legal actions against Chevron to affect Brazil's oil and gas industry and the appetite for large U.S. oil and gas companies to invest in Brazil?
Well, the appetite is something that the companies themselves are going to have to determine. Obviously, there's a lot of money to be made here in the oil and gas sector, not only for the large oil companies, but also for the providers and suppliers who can engage directly with Petrobras and with the larger oil companies in search of and exploitation of oil and gas reserves. We were very concerned by what happened with Chevron, and we worked very closely with Chevron and the Brazilian government to ensure that Chevron is treated in a way that's consistent with Brazilian law, but also is fair across the board. And we've been able to make some significant advances in that regard. And I think what we're going to see over time is a recognition by Brazilians that if they're going to continue to pursue the kinds of resources and especially the revenues that they want from the pre-salt oil reserves, they have willing and able partners in U.S. companies. But in order to attract and keep those companies engaged here, they need to make sure that there is a predictable political and legal environment to operate in. I think that this is a country that is committed to the kinds of partnerships that we've been able to develop over time. I think it's a company that in the case of Chevron, this country is certainly committed to that relationship. Chevron has been in Brazil for over 100 years. And in that sense, I think that over time, we're going to fix this and it's going to come out in a good place. But again, this is an area in which companies that are interested can work directly with our embassy and our consulates to make sure they have a clear understanding of the political environment they're operating in and the legal and regulatory environment.
Thank you. Our next question is from the American Institute of Architects. There are significant opportunities for architecture and construction within Brazil with the 2014 Soccer World Cup and 2016 Summer Olympics. What is the U.S. government doing to help American firms to assist in this infrastructure development?
I'm going to ask my commercial officer, Devin Rambo, to address that. But before I do so, I just want to highlight that infrastructure is one of the most important and pressing needs that Brazil has. If you have to identify a single bottleneck that over time will slow down Brazil's economic growth, it's infrastructure. So as we look at infrastructure issues, we're not only looking at the World Cup and at the Olympics, we're looking at the oil and gas industry, we're looking at their transportation sector, we're looking at their aviation sector, their telecommunications sector, and kind of riverine or waterway transport as major areas where American investment, whether it's through logistics, whether it's through construction itself, or through the provision of transportation devices, whether they be trains, boats, cars, or planes, can play a very important role in Brazil's development and a very important role in enriching American companies. But Devin?
Thank you. I'll just say that there isn't a sector where there aren't infrastructure opportunities, and we're working with U.S. companies across the board in this area. I think one of the key issues is to get to Brazil and to meet partners and to be on the ground here, building the type of partnerships that are going to allow your company to be involved in all the things that are going on and when the bids are coming out. Regarding the games themselves, I think it's important to travel to Rio, to travel to Brasilia, to meet the Olympic Committee, to meet with the Brazilian government entities that are working on the safety and security of all of the games. As you know, the World Cup games themselves will be spread across Brazil, and a lot of the decisions about the building of the stadiums and the infrastructure surrounding the games has been decentralized to the municipal and state levels across Brazil. And so companies will need to focus on those cities where they feel they have the best opportunity. But as the ambassador said, we are here to serve. We're happy to discuss this with your companies and look forward to it.
Okay, our next question for the ambassador is whether he has any thoughts on what U.S. universities can do that are seeking to attract Brazilian students.
Well, as you know, President Rousseff has announced a Science Without Borders scholarship program, which is aimed at sending 101,000 Brazilian young men and women overseas to study at universities in a variety of countries, including the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, and Germany. The first batch of students traveling under this Science Without Borders scholarship program arrived in the United States in January, and we're expecting the second group of students to arrive in September to begin the new school year. It's an exciting moment in Brazil-U.S. relations in this regard, because effectively we have an opportunity not only to bring fully funded Brazilian students into U.S. universities and colleges, but also effectively to build a network of relationships with young men and women who are going to be Brazil's leading scientific and business people for the coming generation. It's a great opportunity for Brazil to globalize its university system and to expose its students not only to university education but also to internships with American companies. But it's also a great opportunity for us strategically to begin to influence how these young men and women are going to view the United States and the world. And in this regard, we've been doing several things to promote American universities and colleges here in Brazil. We have a program called Education USA that works directly with interested students who want to find out about universities and look for potential universities they can use it or attend in the United States to study. But we're also building relationships between universities. We've sent a group of 24 rectors of Brazilian universities to the United States to visit a variety of American universities and community colleges on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in our Middle West. And at the same time, we are hosting and partnering with American universities who are visiting Brazil now in the search of building relationships with universities that would act as either gateways or funnels for Brazilian students traveling to the United States to study. But we have the infrastructure here in Brazil, both at our embassy and in our consulates and through our partner associations and organizations here in Brazil to help all American universities and colleges that are interested in attracting Brazilian students, and we welcome communication with you.
Thank you. We have a question from the Cohen Group. What's the best strategy for a U.S. company looking to expand its footprint in Brazil? Acquisition, or opening a local office, or a joint venture and or a partnership? And if it's the latter, how should a U.S. company go about identifying an ideal business partnership with a Brazilian company?
Well, this is what our Foreign Commercial Service does, so I'm going to ask Devin to answer this one.
Happy to. Well, I think all of the options you list there are certainly viable. It'll depend on the company, it'll depend on the sector, and a number of other factors. But I think the key that you've hit on there in your question, I think is good for all companies to understand, and that it's important that you have the right partnerships in Brazil. And that's not something that you can decide on the telephone or decide perhaps even in one visit to Brazil. It takes a committed effort to figure out the particular sector and industry within Brazil that you'd like to work and in which you'd like to be involved. And I think all those options are certainly viable. And it's a strategy that many U.S. companies have taken in Brazil for many decades and continues to be an approach. Certainly it's something that we can help you with here in Brazil. The U.S. Foreign Commercial Service, one of our key services, is helping U.S. companies find partners in Brazil through some of the services that we have. So we'd be happy to talk to you about that for your particular company. One other thing I wanted to mention is that if companies are interested in doing business with the Brazilian government, selling to the Brazilian government, you're required to have a partner. And so that's another factor to consider as well.
Okay, we have two related questions. The first from Joe Lanzoni. When our products are imported into Brazil, they are assessed with high duties and tariffs. Is any work being done to try to lower these trade barriers? And then there's another question more generally, is there any work being done to promote a free trade agreement? And what is the likelihood of a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Brazil?
Well, let's start with the last question first. At this point in time, we are not working on a free trade agreement, although Secretary Clinton, when she was here recently, did suggest that Brazil and the United States need to start looking at the possibility of doing a free trade agreement. What we have done, however, is negotiate really the first formal commercial agreement between the United States and Brazil in decades, which is an agreement on trade and economic cooperation, which is an umbrella agreement that allows the U.S. Trade Representative and Brazilian counterparts to begin engaging on very specific negotiations that we believe will begin to open markets reciprocally for American businesses and Brazilian businesses. And in this regard, we believe that we will have an opportunity to start creating the building blocks of a larger trading relationship that could eventually lead to a free trade agreement. But obviously, barriers on trade, and especially high tariffs, are a concern to us, and it's something that we work on with our Brazilian partners, both through international organizations like the WTO, but also in our international or in our bilateral engagement. And what we're trying to do, obviously, is create a level playing field from which we can all operate. But I'm going to ask James Dudley to talk a little bit about tariffs and what we've been doing, and then also ask Devin to talk a little bit about what this means for trade.
Well, Brazil does have relatively high tariffs in a lot of areas, and part of that is because it's a member of the Mercosul customs union that have common tariffs. We're engaged in negotiations with them in the World Trade Organization that we hope will, in the long term, result in lowering tariffs worldwide on goods and services. And then one other thing that we're hoping to do as part of the agreement that USTR signed with the Brazilians is promote an investment dialogue that will help both U.S. companies investing in Brazil and also Brazilian companies investing in the U.S., because we're trying to encourage them to do that to help create U.S. jobs as well.
Devin?
Great. Exactly. The tariff structure in Brazil can be complicated. It can be complex. It's important to work with your partners in Brazil, to work with legal teams in Brazil to understand what it means to your product and the final price as it gets to market. I mean, it's an important consideration to have. We have a number of different fora, as the ambassador mentioned, in which we work to discuss these issues with Brazil, one of which is our U.S.-Brazil commercial dialogue, which is a government-to-government dialogue where we discuss these types of issues as they affect both Brazilian companies and U.S. companies. We have another dialogue called the CEO Forum, which is comprised of U.S. and 15 Brazilian, or 12 Brazilian and 12 U.S. companies, where tariffs is one of the things that they discuss. Both of these groups will be meeting soon. But it's a common subject. Many companies are talking about it because it affects their ability to operate well in Brazil. We enjoy having the conversation with you and look forward to that.
Okay. To our participants, if you have more questions, please send them in using the chat room. You mentioned infrastructure before, and infrastructure opportunities. One aspect that has generated a lot of interest is the aviation sector. So can you talk about what Brazil is doing to modernize that?
For us, this is one of the most exciting sectors right now for a variety of reasons. First, the huge domestic demand for flight and aviation services. We've seen on a year-to-year basis about a 25% increase annually in demand for flights by Brazilians. This really is such a large country that the only way you can travel from one end to the other is by air. Brazil doesn't have a national railway system, and its national road system is quite limited, which means that Brazilians fly, which means there's a huge demand for airplanes and for everything related to aviation. We were very excited during the visit of President Obama here in 2011 to be able to sign an open skies agreement with Brazil, which will come into kind of full vigor in 2015, but we will be able to kind of phase in over time beginning very soon. And this will open up markets for American airlines in Brazil and for Brazilian airlines in the United States. On top of that, during President Rousseff's visit to Washington recently, we were able to sign an aviation partnership agreement, which effectively extends our cooperation throughout the entire civil aviation field, but especially in areas like air traffic control, airport maintenance, and other important aspects of civil aviation. And so in this regard, we are, along with the Brazilians, building probably one of our most modern and interesting aviation relationships in South America. And given Brazil's size, and given the fact that almost everything that flies in South America comes and goes from Brazil, this is going to create a lot of opportunity for American companies at different levels in the civil aviation process. But James, would you like to comment on that?
Well, one specific example of the opportunities is going to be made evident today when the Brazilian government signs contracts with 3 private consortia to manage some of the country's largest international airports. And they're also expected to announce today that at least 3 more airports, or concessions for at least 3 more airports, will be auctioned later this year. And so they will now have 4 consortia running private airports, and the reason they're doing that is the government is not able to invest as much as it would like to in modernizing the airports to handle the tremendous increase in passenger traffic. And so they're going to rely on private sector investment, and they expect these consortia to invest billions of dollars over the next several years, and that provides a lot of opportunities for American companies to sell air traffic control systems and construction equipment, all sorts of things to the new managers at the airport. And that's an example of the kind of infrastructure investment that the government is trying to encourage, and that we're very pleased about. One other question, do you have any thoughts on how the government sees foreign investors and foreign investment? There's been a long U.S. presence here. Lots of U.S. companies have been here for decades, and is there any distinction between how the government views U.S. companies and Brazilian companies?
I'm going to ask Devin to address that question, but I want to start by saying that for the most part, foreign investors here are welcome. Brazil has recognized that some of its most important commercial and industrial advances have come through partnership with foreign companies and foreign investors. This is true in civil aviation, it's true in oil and gas, it's true in agriculture, it's true in the automobile sector, it's true in nearly all of the large important industrial and especially now the high-tech sectors of the Brazilian economy. So in that sense, I think people interested in investing in Brazil will find an open environment and an open market.
I would certainly reiterate that it's a very open environment here for U.S. investors, and I think Brazil looks very fondly on that. At Commerce, we focus. We have a program called Select USA where we're focusing on Brazilian investment in the United States, and you've probably seen some of this around. And we're organizing a conference in the United States where we'll be taking major Brazilian investors to the United States later this year for a conference on working more with Brazilian investors as they become global players. One thing that we're seeing with Brazilian investors is they need to have a presence in the United States to really become a true global player. And so this sort of fits well within that niche as well. So I think that we're doing quite a bit in that area.
Okay. Our last question is from Agilent Technologies. The ambassador mentioned that collaboration in science and technology was a key part of our partnership for the 21st century. What areas does the embassy think present the best opportunities for U.S. companies?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm going to ask Devin to address some of the specific opportunities. But before I do that, let me say that when President Rousseff and President Obama met for the first time, and they began to lay out their national priorities, at the top of both presidents' lists was science and technology, deepening the capacity of both of our societies to do more science, better technology, more research and development. And for President Rousseff, she's convinced that for Brazil to make a strategic leap economically and to be able to meet its economic and social development needs, it needs to move beyond commodities, it needs to move beyond basic manufacturing into high-end manufacturing, and especially science and technology. And the Brazilians are working very hard to try to link the research and development work being done in their universities with what is happening in companies and on production lines and on factory floors. This is a new thing for them. Historically, Brazilian companies have not invested a lot in research and development, but they're finding very useful and interesting partners in the United States. Some key U.S. companies have set up either centers of excellence or laboratories or research centers here in Brazil, and are using those research centers and laboratories to build capacity here in Brazil, but also to connect to a growing network of laboratories and research facilities that are going to be important partners in Brazil's economic development going forward. But I think in this regard, almost all fields are open, but I'll ask Devin to identify a couple of them.
Right. There just isn't a sector in Brazil where there doesn't pose potential for U.S. companies. The Brazilians look to the U.S. for our technology and for our innovation, so there's a lot of space for U.S. companies to be involved. I think some of the key sectors would be ag equipment and machinery, IT equipment, chemicals, defense, telecommunications. Those are some of the big ones. Aviation, civil aviation, oil and gas, parts and materials, and services. Those are some of the big ones, the biggest dollar value exports to Brazil. But it runs the full gamut, and we see that from our chair and our offices across Brazil. There just hardly isn't a U.S. sector that isn't represented here. I think the key is there is opportunity for your company in Brazil. It's finding the right approach to find the success within that sector that's key, and that's something that we're happy to work with you on.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. We hope this exchange has been useful for our participants, and we would appreciate any feedback you might have. This afternoon, we'll email everyone who registered and explain how to get in touch with our industry specialists and how to get more information on Brazil and opportunities for you. Thank you for your participation, and have a good afternoon.
Okay.